Have you ever wondered what it takes to completely disappear? I do not mean running away or packing a bag in the middle of the night. I mean vanishing right in plain sight. It is a terrifying, desperate kind of magic. It requires absolute silence. It demands that you swallow your pride, your hunger, and your own voice. You have to learn how to walk without making a sound, how to breathe without drawing attention, and how to look at people without ever really meeting their eyes. For 16-year-old Caleb Vance, this invisibility was not a choice. It was his only survival strategy. And before the sirens wailed, before the gunfire echoed through the halls, and before the blood stained the school floors, Caleb was just a ghost haunting his own life. The year was 1999. It was late December, and a brutal, unforgiving winter had descended upon Pine Ridge, Oregon. Pine Ridge was a tough, isolated place carved deeply into the dark, evergreen forests of the Pacific Northwest. It was a logging town, the kind of place where people worked hard, spoke little, and carried heavy burdens in silence. The sky here rarely turned blue during the winter months. Instead, it was a constant, heavy sheet of gray pressing down on the town like a suffocating blanket. The wind did not just blow, it howled. It ripped through the tall pine trees, and it carried a biting, bitter cold that seeped past your clothes right into your bones. In the shadow of an abandoned lumber mill on the absolute edge of town sat a rusted, faded blue 1989 Chevy Nova. The tires were flat on the left side, and the rear window was patched with heavy layers of duct tape. To anyone driving by, it was just another piece of forgotten junk left to rot in the snow. But to Caleb, this freezing metal box was home. He had been living inside this car for 4 agonizing months. Inside the cabin, the temperature was deadly. Caleb lay curled in the back seat, his knees pulled tightly to his chest. He was wrapped in 3 thin, moth-eaten moving blankets, but they offered almost no protection. The cold inside the car was a physical presence. It felt like a heavy weight pressing against his chest, making every breath a shallow, painful yow. The windows were completely frosted over from the inside, coated in a thick layer of ice, formed entirely by the moisture of his own shivering breath. Caleb opened his eyes. It was still dark outside. His body violently shook, a natural, desperate reaction to the plummeting temperature. He could not feel his toes, and his fingers were stiff, pale, and aching. He carefully uncurled his stiff limbs, groaning softly as his joints popped in the freezing air. He had to keep moving. If you fall into a deep sleep in this kind of cold, his father used to say, you do not wake up. His father. The thought sent a sharp, agonizing ache through Caleb's chest, a pain that had absolutely nothing to do with the winter air. Thomas Vance had been a giant of a man, a veteran logger with rough hands and a loud, booming laugh. He had been Caleb's entire world. But the forest is unforgiving. 6 months ago, a heavy steel rigging cable snapped on the job site. The accident was sudden, brutal, and fatal. Thomas was gone before the ambulance even reached the muddy logging road. After the funeral, Caleb's world collapsed. There was no life insurance, no savings, and no extended family to take him in. The bank foreclosed on their small rented cabin within weeks. Then came the social workers with their sympathetic eyes and their cold clinical clipboards. They talked about group homes, foster care, and county wards. Caleb knew the stories. He had seen kids go into the system, bouncing from one crowded facility to another, losing whatever spark they had left. He could not do it. He refused to be a file on a desk. So the night before the county officials came to take him away, Caleb packed his clothes into a duffel bag, stole the keys to his dad's broken-down Nova, and simply vanished into the shadows of Pine Ridge. Now, he survived on a razor's edge. His daily routine was a masterclass in deception, a carefully choreographed dance to keep the world from noticing his desperate reality. Slowly, Caleb pushed the heavy, damp blankets off his shoulders. The sudden exposure to the raw air made his teeth chatter violently. He reached into the front passenger seat, pulling a frozen bottle of water toward him. It was completely solid. He sighed, a small cloud of white vapor escaping his lips. No water this morning. He moved carefully in the cramped space. He kept his school clothes perfectly folded, inside a plastic bin in the trunk, protecting them from the dampness of the car. He had to look normal. Normalcy was his armor. If he looked poor, if he looked homeless, people would ask questions. Questions led to the police, and the police led to the group home. He peeled off his heavy sweat-stained sleeping layers, shivering violently in his underwear for a terrifying 10 seconds, before pulling on his cold jeans and a faded flannel shirt. His stomach twisted, letting out a hollow, painful growl. He had not eaten a real meal in 2 days. His diet consisted mostly of stolen crackers from the school cafeteria and the occasional bruised apple tossed out by the local grocery store. He tightened his leather belt by another notch. He was wasting away, losing weight at a dangerous pace, his cheekbones becoming sharp and pronounced under his pale skin. He ignored the hunger. Hunger was just a feeling, he told himself, and feelings could be pushed down. He grabbed his worn canvas backpack, checking the contents. A few notebooks, a stolen pencil, and a heavy flashlight. He pushed the heavy car door open. It creaked loudly, the frozen metal groaning in protest. Caleb stepped out into the knee-deep snow. The freezing wind hit him instantly, stinging his face like tiny needles. He pulled his thin winter coat tighter, pulling a faded beanie down over his ears. He began the long 2-mile trek to Pine Ridge High School. He had to get there a full hour before the first bell. He needed to slip through the broken latch on the gymnasium's side door, sneak into the boys' locker room, and use the hot showers to thaw his freezing limbs before the janitor arrived. It was a massive risk every single day. If he was caught, the illusion would shatter. As he walked down the dark, snow-covered roads, the town slowly began to wake up. He saw warm yellow lights turning on in the windows of the houses he passed. He imagined the families inside. He pictured parents making coffee, kids complaining about homework, the smell of toast and bacon filling the warm air. It felt like watching a movie of a world he used to belong to. A world that was now locked behind a thick wall of glass. A heavy logging truck roared past him, its massive tires kicking up a spray of icy slush. Caleb stepped back into the snowbank, lowering his head, letting the world rush past. He was the ghost of Pine Ridge. He walked among them, sat in their classrooms, and breathed their air. But he was entirely alone. He did not know it yet. But this freezing, ordinary Tuesday would be the day the glass shattered. It would be the day he finally stopped hiding, the day the invisible boy would be forced to step out of the shadows and walk straight into hell. The side door of the Pine Ridge High School gymnasium was a heavy, rust-covered piece of metal. To the rest of the school, it was just a broken fire exit. To Caleb Vance, it was the only lifeline he had left. At exactly 6 in the morning, the campus was dead quiet. The sky was still a bruised, dark purple. Caleb pressed his freezing shoulder against the cold steel of the door. He pushed hard, leaning his entire body weight into it. With a sharp, painful groan, the old latch gave way. He slipped inside, instantly enveloped by the thick, warm air of the boiler room. He moved quickly. He had exactly 14 minutes before Mr. Henderson, the head janitor, started his morning rounds. Caleb navigated the dark, familiar corridors of the athletic wing with practiced ease. He pushed open the door to the boys' locker room, the smell of bleach and old sweat hitting his nose. He turned on the third shower head in the back row. It was the only one that immediately ran hot. He stripped off his cold, stiff clothes, shivering violently as the damp chill clung to his skin. He stepped under the spray. The hot water hitting his frozen skin felt like 1,000 tiny needles. It was a sharp, burning agony that slowly melted into a profound, heavy relief. He closed his eyes, letting the heat seep into his aching bones, washing away the smell of the damp car and the freezing night. But he could not stay. Survival was a clock, and it was always ticking. He turned off the water, grabbed rough paper towels from the dispenser, and dried himself as fast as he could. Dressing was a careful, calculated ritual. Caleb pulled on his clean jeans and his faded flannel shirt, smoothing out every wrinkle with his cold hands. He checked his reflection in the cracked mirror above the sinks. His face was too thin, his cheekbones sharp and hollow, and heavy dark circles shadowed his pale blue eyes. He splashed cold water on his face, slapped his cheeks to bring some color into them, and forced a completely neutral expression. The ghost mask was on. By 7:30, the hallways of Pine Ridge High transformed from a quiet tomb into a chaotic, screaming sea of teenagers. Lockers slammed like gunfire. Heavy boots squeaked against the polished linoleum, and the air filled with the thick scent of cheap perfume and winter coats. Caleb walked through the center of the chaos, keeping his head down, his eyes fixed on the floor tiles. He moved with a quiet, fluid grace, dodging shoulders and backpacks, never bumping into anyone, never leaving a trace. The rules of being invisible were simple. Do not make eye contact. Do not walk too close to the walls, or you look suspicious. Do not walk too close to the center, or you become an obstacle. Speak only when spoken to, and keep the answers completely boring. It was exhausting. It required a level of hyper-awareness that drained whatever energy he had left. As he passed the cafeteria, the heavy, greasy smell of hash browns and breakfast sausages rolled out into the hallway. Caleb stopped dead in his tracks. His stomach violently cramped, a sharp, twisting pain that made him double over slightly. He squeezed his eyes shut, his hands balling into fists inside his jacket pockets. He had not eaten a hot meal in 5 days. The hunger was no longer just an empty feeling. It was a living, breathing thing inside of him, clawing at his ribs, making his vision blur and his hands shake. He forced himself to take a deep breath, swallowed the thick, bitter saliva in his mouth, and kept walking. He turned the corner near the main office, and his heart instantly dropped. Standing by the trophy case, holding a steaming cup of coffee, was Officer Sarah Jenkins. Officer Jenkins was the school resource officer. She was a tough, sharp-eyed woman in her late 30s, wearing a dark blue uniform that looked a size too big for her. She was overworked, underpaid, and deeply exhausted by the broken system she tried to fix. She knew every troubled kid in Pine Ridge, she knew the bad families, and she knew when someone was falling through the cracks. For the last month, she had been watching Caleb. Caleb tried to pivot, trying to blend into a group of loud freshmen, but it was too late. Her eyes locked onto him. "Caleb." She called out, her voice cutting through the noise of the hallway. "Hold up a minute." Panic flared in Caleb's chest, cold and sharp. He forced his breathing to slow down. He turned around, painting a polite, confused smile on his face. "Good morning, Officer Jenkins." She walked over to him, her heavy duty belt creaking with every step. She stood a little too close, invading his personal space, her dark eyes scanning his face, his thin frame, and the faded fabric of his jacket. She did not look angry. She looked terribly, deeply sad, and that was infinitely more dangerous. "You missed homeroom again yesterday, Caleb," she said quietly, keeping her voice down so the passing students could not hear. "And you have been wearing that same flannel shirt for 3 days. I do laundry on weekends." Caleb lied smoothly, his voice completely steady. "And I had a dentist appointment yesterday morning. I brought a note." Jenkins sighed, taking a sip of her coffee. She did not buy a single word of it. I called the number you gave the office, Caleb. The one for your uncle in Portland. A woman answered. She said she had owned that number for 2 years, and she had never heard of a Thomas Vance or a Caleb Vance. The floor felt like it was tilting beneath him. The safety net was gone. He was falling. He must have given me the wrong area code. Caleb stammered slightly, digging his nails into his palms to keep his hands from shaking. He just moved. It is a new cell phone. I will get the right number and bring it to the office. Caleb, listen to me, Jenkins said, her voice softening, stepping even closer. She reached out her hand, hovering just an inch from his shoulder. You do not have to do this. I know things fell apart after your dad passed. I know there is no uncle in Portland. I do not know where you are sleeping, but I know it is not safe. Let me help you. I can make some calls. We can find a warm place for you. You do not have to fight this alone. It was the rope. She was throwing him the rope, pulling him toward the light, toward a warm bed and hot food. But Caleb looked at her, and all he saw was the system. He saw the cold, sterile walls of a county group home. He saw crowded rooms, locked doors, and a life entirely controlled by strangers with clipboards. He saw himself losing the very last piece of freedom he had left. I appreciate it. Officer Jenkins, Caleb said, his voice dropping into a cold, flat monotone. But you are wrong. I am fine. My uncle is coming down this weekend to fix the paperwork. I have to get to biology now. He did not wait for her to answer. He turned and walked away, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Jenkins watched him go, her shoulders slumping in defeat. She could not arrest him for being poor. She could not detain him without proof of neglect, and she was drowning in a sea of 20 other kids who also needed her help. She let him walk away, hoping he would make it through the week. Caleb practically ran down the C-wing corridor, his breath coming in short hegatoaps. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a crushing, dizzying exhaustion. His legs felt like lead. The edges of his vision were turning dark, the hallway lights stretching into bright, blurry lines. He needed to sit down. He needed to hide. He was so focused on keeping his balance, so focused on escaping the heavy gaze of Officer Jenkins, that he completely forgot the first rule of being invisible. He stopped watching the people around him. He rounded the corner near the science labs, walking far too fast, his head down. He did not see the girl in the heavy combat boots and the vintage denim jacket stepping out of the counselor's office. He did not see Maya Rossi until it was far too late. The impact was sudden, sharp, and physically devastating for a boy running on empty. Caleb crashed hard into the solid figure stepping out of the counselor's office, his legs already trembling from exhaustion, and hunger simply gave out. He hit the polished linoleum floor with a heavy, painful thud. His worn canvas backpack slipped from his shoulder, hitting the ground and bursting open. Weeks of carefully written biology notes, history assignments, and stolen cafeteria napkins scattered across the hallway like autumn leaves caught in a harsh wind. Panic, cold, and absolute seized his chest. He had drawn attention. He had made a scene. But the true terror set in when he looked up and recognized the scuffed, heavy combat boots standing just inches from his hands. It was Maya Rossi. In the complex, brutal social hierarchy of Pine Ridge High School, Maya existed in a category entirely her own. She was not the prom queen. She was not a cheerleader, and she did not sit with the athletes. She walked the halls, wrapped in a terrifying, impenetrable aura of isolation. Her father was Big Vic Rossi, the president of the Iron Hounds Motorcycle Club. Big Vic was a mountain of a man, a local legend with hands like cinder blocks and a dark, heavy beard. When he rode through town on his custom chopper, the ground physically shook, and people quickly stepped out of his way. The unspoken rule among the students and even the teachers was universally understood. You do not look at Maya Rossi, you do not talk to her, and you certainly do not cross her. A single disrespectful word or a misplaced joke could bring a dozen heavily armed, leather-clad bikers to the school parking lot before the final bell rang. Because of this, Maya was a ghost in her own right. People did not see a teenage girl. They saw the terrifying shadow of her father standing right behind her. Caleb scrambled to his hands and knees, his breath catching in his throat. His heart hammered wildly against his bruised ribs. He blindly reached out his freezing, shaking fingers, desperately trying to gather his scattered papers. "I am sorry," he stammered, his voice cracking his head, bowed completely down. "I am so sorry. I was not looking. I will get out of your way." He waited for the harsh words. He waited for the heavy boot to kick his papers away, or for the cold, arrogant sneer that the untouchable kids always used. Instead, he heard the soft rustle of vintage denim. Maya dropped to her knees right there on the cold floor, directly across from him. "Hey, take a breath," she said quietly. Her voice was nothing like he expected. It was not hard, it was not loud, and it carried absolutely no malice. It was soft, melodic, and incredibly gentle. She reached out her hands, moving quickly, gathering his biology notes into a neat stack. "It is just paper," she added, handing the stack toward him. "I'm not going to bite you." Caleb slowly raised his head. His wide, exhausted blue eyes met hers. For a single fleeting second, the heavy protective walls they both wore completely shattered. Maya looked at the boy kneeling in front of her. She did not see a nobody or a piece of background scenery. She saw a boy whose skin was terrifyingly pale. She saw a thin, faded flannel shirt that was entirely useless against the Oregon winter. And she saw a profound, ancient sadness in his eyes, a familiar kind of pain that she recognized perfectly. And Caleb looked at Maya. He did not see the fearsome daughter of a notorious biker boss. He saw a 16-year-old girl with tired eyes hiding inside a heavy jacket. He saw someone who was suffocating under the weight of a reputation she did not ask for. He saw a girl who was incredibly, desperately lonely. "You are Caleb, right?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, holding the papers out to him. "We have biology together." Third period. The fact that she knew his name, that she had actually noticed him sitting in the back row, sent a strange, warm shockwave through his chest. It was the very first time in 6 months that another human being had looked at him and truly seen him. "Yeah," Caleb whispered, his hands trembling violently as he reached out to take the papers. "Thank you. Do not worry about it, Caleb," she said softly. She stood up, brushing the dust off the knees of her jeans. She looked down at him, offered a small, almost invisible smile, and turned away. Her heavy boots clicked rhythmically against the floor as she walked down the hall, slipping back into her armor of isolation. Caleb stayed on his knees for a moment, clutching his papers to his chest. The hallway noise slowly rushed back into his ears, but the heavy, crushing weight of his mourning had slightly lifted. He was not completely invisible. Outside the school, the gray sky pressed down even harder on the town of Pine Ridge. The wind howled across the student parking lot, rattling the bare branches of the oak trees. In the furthest corner of the lot, away from the warm streetlights, a rusted dark green sedan pulled into a parking space. The engine rattled violently before dying out. Elias Thorne sat behind the steering wheel. He was a senior, a quiet, forgotten kid who blended perfectly into the gray background of the town. But today, Elias was not hiding. His hands gripped the freezing steering wheel, his knuckles completely white. His eyes were blank, staring straight ahead, completely devoid of any light any hope, or any emotion. For 3 years, Elias had watched the wealthy athletic elite of Pine Ridge High School relentlessly torment his younger brother Tommy. He had watched the teachers look away. He had watched the principal nod, smile, and do absolutely nothing, while Tommy came home with bruised ribs, torn clothes, and a broken spirit. Last night, Tommy had tried to swallow a bottle of sleeping pills. He was currently lying in a hospital bed, barely breathing, while his bullies were inside this building laughing, joking, and living their perfect lives. The system had failed Tommy. The town had failed Tommy, and Elias had finally snapped. Elias reached over to the passenger seat. He unzipped a heavy dark green canvas duffel bag. His trembling fingers reached inside, tracing the cold, unforgiving black steel of a semi-automatic rifle. He pulled the heavy weapon into his lap, feeling its terrible weight. The time for asking for help was over. The time for being ignored was completely done. Elias opened the car door, stepping out into the freezing wind, pulling the heavy bag over his shoulder. He looked up at the brick facade of the high school. He was going to make them see him. He was going to make them feel every ounce of pain they had inflicted on his family. The clock above the main entrance read 9:45. The quietest part of the morning was about to end, and the halls of Pine Ridge High were about to run red. Third period at Pine Ridge High School was always the heaviest part of the day. The frantic, nervous energy of the morning had completely burned off. It was replaced by a dull, suffocating routine. The fluorescent lights buzzed with a low, constant hum. The radiators hissed in the corners of the classrooms, fighting a losing battle against the freezing Oregon winter. In the hallways, the silence was almost absolute. You could hear the faint, muffled voices of teachers lecturing behind heavy wooden doors and the rhythmic, endless ticking of the wall clocks. It was a perfectly normal, terribly boring Tuesday. It was the kind of quiet that makes you drop your guard. Caleb Vance was not in class. He was skipping physical education. It was a calculated, necessary risk. He could not afford to stand in the bright, harsh lights of the locker room. He could not let the other boys see his hollow ribs, his bruised collarbones, or the terrible gray tint of his skin. He could not let them see that he was wearing the exact same clothes he had worn for days. Instead, he was hiding. He sat on the top landing of the northern stairwell. It was a dead zone. The security cameras did not point there, and the janitors rarely cleaned it. It smelled like old dust and damp concrete. Caleb sat with his back pressed hard against the cold cinder block wall. His knees were pulled tightly to his chest. He held a battered, stolen paperback book in his hands, but he was not reading. His mind was miles away. He kept replaying the collision in the hallway. He kept seeing Maya Rossi kneeling on the floor. He remembered the soft, unexpected warmth in her voice. "It is just paper. I am not going to bite you." He closed his eyes, leaning his head back. For a boy who spent every waking second trying to be invisible, the simple act of being seen was intoxicating. It was a tiny, dangerous spark of hope in his freezing world. Downstairs in the sprawling expanse of the C-Wing corridor, Maya Rossi was walking alone. She was returning from the main office. She had been summoned to drop off a late attendance slip, a lingering consequence of missing school, while her father dealt with club business. The hallway stretched out before her, a long, empty tunnel of metal lockers and scuffed floor tiles. Her heavy combat boots echoed loudly in the quiet space. She walked with her head down, her hands buried deep in the pockets of her vintage denim jacket. She was thinking about Caleb, too. She could not shake the image of his pale, terrified face. She recognized the look of a trapped animal. She knew exactly what it felt like to be completely isolated in a crowded room. At 10:14 in the morning, the heavy, boring quiet of Pine Ridge High School was violently shattered. It started near the main entrance. Elias Thorne pushed through the double glass doors. He did not sneak in. He did not hide his face. He walked with a heavy, terrifying purpose. He had left his coat in his car. Despite the freezing temperature outside, his face was pale and slick with sweat. His eyes were wide, glassy, and completely detached from reality. He was no longer Elias the quiet senior. He was an instrument of pure, unadulterated grief. He unzipped the heavy canvas duffel bag as he walked, letting it drop to the floor. He raised the dark, heavy barrel of the semi-automatic rifle. He racked the bolt. The metallic clack was sharp, cold, and definitive. Pop, pop, pop. At first, the sound did not register as gunfire. To Caleb sitting in the stairwell, it sounded like someone dropping a stack of heavy textbooks onto a hollow desk. To Maya, standing in the middle of the C-wing, it sounded like construction noise from the parking lot. Human brains are simply not wired to expect the sound of war in a place of learning. But then the screams began. They were not the playful, high-pitched shrieks of teenagers joking in the cafeteria. They were visceral, tearing, guttural sounds. They were the sounds of absolute, unimaginable terror. They ripped through the heavy silence of the building, echoing down the halls, bouncing off the metal lockers. The pop-pop-pop sound grew louder, closer, and more rhythmic. It was deliberate. It was hunting. Suddenly, the school's public address system crackled to life with a sharp burst of static. The principal's voice echoed through the speakers. He was a man who usually spoke with a slow, commanding monotone. Now his voice was pitched an octave higher. It was trembling violently, cracking with raw, unfiltered panic. Code Red. This is not a drill. Lockdown. Code Red. The words triggered an immediate automated nightmare. Flashing white strobe lights on the ceiling began to pulse, casting harsh, terrifying shadows across the walls. A high-pitched, deafening alarm started to blare, drowning out the screams. At the end of the C-wing corridor, the heavy reinforced fire doors began to automatically swing shut. The magnetic locks released, sealing the building into distinct, isolated sections to contain a threat. Maya froze. Adrenaline, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. It paralyzed her. Her heavy boots felt glued to the linoleum floor. She watched in horror as the heavy fire doors clicked shut, locking down the exits. She was trapped right in the middle of the open hallway. There was no cover, no alcove, and nowhere to hide. Around her, chaos erupted behind the classroom doors. Teachers were screaming orders. She heard the frantic scraping of heavy desks being dragged across the floor to barricade the entrances. She heard the distinct, terrifying click of deadbolts snapping into place. "Hey!" Maya yelled, her voice tearing from her throat. "Let me in!" She ran to the nearest classroom door. She slammed her hands against the reinforced glass window, pounding her fists against the heavy wood. "Please let me in!" Inside the classroom, the lights were turned off. The students were huddled in the far corner, crying, their hands covering their heads. The teacher, a young woman with tears streaming freely down her face, walked slowly toward the door. She looked through the small glass window. She made direct eye contact with Maya. The teacher's eyes were filled with an agonizing, unbearable pity. She looked at the terrified 16-year-old girl, begging for her life, but the teacher shook her head. Protocol was absolute. In a Code Red lockdown, you never, ever open a locked door. Once it is sealed, you do not open it for anyone. You secure the room and you wait. The teacher placed her hand flat against the glass from the inside, a silent apology. And then she backed away into the shadows, disappearing from view. Maya was entirely alone. The isolation she had worn like armor for years was now a physical, terrifying reality. She pressed her back against the cold metal lockers, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. Her breath came in short, desperate gasps. She looked down the long, flashing corridor. From the intersection of the main hall, a dark figure stepped into the C-wing. Elias Thorne turned the corner. His boots crunched softly on the shattered glass of a broken display case. Smoke drifted lazily from the barrel of his rifle. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving with every step. He looked down the long, empty expanse of the hallway. Through the flashing white strobe lights, his dead, glassy eyes locked directly onto Maya Rossi. He did not know her personally. He did not know her favorite color, or her gentle voice, or her secret loneliness. But he knew exactly who her father was. He knew what she represented. To Elias and his fractured, broken mind, Maya was the ultimate symbol of the untouchable elite. She was the power that the town bowed down to. She was the kind of person who never faced consequences while boys like his brother Tommy were broken into pieces. Today, Elias wanted to break the unbreakable. Today, he wanted the untouchables to bleed. He stopped walking. He planted his feet firmly on the polished floor tiles. Slowly, deliberately, he raised the heavy barrel of the rifle, pointing it straight down the hallway, aiming directly at the center of Maya's vintage denim jacket. Up in the northern stairwell, Caleb had heard the principal's terrified voice. He had heard the deafening alarm. His street-honed survival instincts, sharpened by months of living in the dark, dangerous alleys of Pine Ridge, kicked in immediately. The rules were simple. Flight, hide, survive. Trust no one, and save yourself. He crept slowly down the concrete stairs, pushing the heavy metal door open just a tiny fraction of an inch to assess the hallway. Through the narrow crack, he saw Maya Rossi. He saw her pressed flat against the lockers, abandoned, terrified, and completely exposed. And 30 yards away, he saw Elias Thorne raising the black rifle, preparing to fire. Caleb Vance had spent the last 4 months mastering the art of self-preservation. When you are entirely alone in the world, your brain rewires itself. It strips away empathy, it strips away bravery, and it leaves only the raw, desperate instinct to survive. Every fiber of his being, every street-taught lesson he had learned, screamed at him to close the heavy metal door. He was supposed to turn around, run up the concrete stairs, and disappear into the shadows. He owed this town absolutely nothing. Pine Ridge had let his father die. Pine Ridge had let him starve in a freezing, rusted car. The people in this building had looked right through him for months. But as Caleb peered through the narrow crack of the stairwell door, his survival instincts completely short-circuited. He did not see a nameless, faceless student. He saw Maya Rossi. He saw the girl who had dropped to her knees on the cold floor to help him. He remembered the exact tone of her voice. It was soft, melodic, and completely devoid of judgment. He remembered the way she had looked into his exhausted eyes and offered him a tiny shred of human dignity. In a world that had treated him like absolute garbage, Maya had treated him like a person. That single fleeting moment of kindness was a heavy anchor. It pulled Caleb out of the shadows and anchored him to the terrifying present. Elias Thorne's finger tightened on the trigger. The muscles in his pale arm tensed. Caleb did not think. If he had stopped to think, if he had paused to calculate the physics of a bullet, or the fragility of his own starving body, he would have stayed behind the door. But the human heart is a reckless, illogical thing. His legs moved completely on their own. He shoved the heavy metal door open with explosive force. The door slammed violently against the cinder block wall, the loud crash echoing down the hallway. Caleb burst out of the stairwell. He was running entirely on pure, unadulterated adrenaline. It masked the deep, gnawing ache in his stomach. It fueled his exhausted, trembling muscles. He sprinted down the C-wing, his worn sneakers pounding against the polished linoleum floor. "Maya, get down!" Caleb screamed. His voice was unrecognizable. It was a raw, primal roar that tore from his throat, echoing violently through the flashing, terrifying corridor. It was the loudest sound he had made in 6 months. At the end of the hallway, Elias flinched. The sudden explosive noise broke his dark trance. His head snapped toward Caleb. His hands gripped the rifle tightly, and the heavy black barrel instinctively swung toward the charging figure. Caleb did not slow down. He did not hesitate. He crossed the 30 yards in a blur of desperate motion. He launched himself into the air just as Elias leveled the weapon. He did not just tackle Maya. He completely enveloped her. He threw his arms around her shoulders, spinning them both around effectively. Placing his own back squarely between Maya and the shooter, he pulled her down toward the cold, hard floor. The rifle fired. The sound of the gunshot was catastrophic. In the enclosed, narrow space of the C-wing corridor, the concussive roar was physically deafening. It rattled the metal lockers, and it vibrated in Caleb's teeth. The impact of the bullet was nothing like the movies. There was no clean hole, and there was no gentle, dramatic fall. Taking a high-velocity rifle round at close range feels like being violently struck by a speeding freight train. The heavy spinning piece of lead tore into Caleb's upper left back. It shattered his shoulder blade into a dozen jagged pieces, ripped through his muscle tissue, and exited violently through his collarbone in a thick, terrifying mist of crimson. The sheer, brutal, kinetic energy of the bullet threw them both to the floor. They hit the linoleum in a tangled, chaotic mess of limbs. It was exactly like their collision from earlier that morning. But this time, the ground was instantly slick with hot, dark blood. Caleb gasped, his mouth opening in a silent, agonizing scream. Every single ounce of air was violently expelled from his lungs. A blinding, white-hot agony radiated from his shattered chest, instantly blurring his vision. The pain was absolute, consuming his entire world. He pinned Maya completely to the floor beneath his heavier weight. His thin flannel shirt was shredded, and his dark red blood immediately began to soak rapidly into her vintage denim jacket. Maya was completely paralyzed by the shock. Her ears were ringing with a high-pitched, unbearable whine from the gunshot. She felt the heavy, crushing weight of the boy on top of her. She felt the sudden, terrifying wetness spreading across her chest. She opened her eyes, looking at the face hovering just inches above hers. It was the boy from the hallway. It was Caleb. Maya screamed, the pure terror finally breaking through her shock. Her hands immediately came up, instinctively pushing against him, but they were instantly covered in thick, warm, dark red blood. "Oh my God, Caleb!" Caleb tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He tasted pennies. The sharp, metallic taste of copper flooded his mouth. He was suffocating. His left lung, dangerously close to the exit wound, was rapidly filling with fluid. He forced his eyes to stay open desperately, fighting the heavy, dark curtain of unconsciousness that was threatening to fall over him. He slowly, agonizingly turned his head. He looked down the hallway. Through the flashing white strobe lights and the thick gray smoke of the gunpowder, he saw Elias Thorne. Elias was standing completely frozen. The heavy rifle was still raised, wavering slightly in his trembling hands. The blank, dead expression on his face had fractured. He was staring at the massive, terrifying pool of blood rapidly spreading across the white floor tiles. He was staring at the emaciated homeless boy bleeding out on the floor, protecting a girl who lived in a completely different universe than them both. Caleb's breathing was ragged, wet, and terribly shallow. The pain in his shoulder was no longer just a sharp sting. It was a heavy burning fire that consumed his entire left side. He could not move his arm. It lay completely useless against the floor, a dead weight. The cold linoleum against his cheek was a stark contrast to the boiling heat radiating from his chest. Maya was sobbing now. It was not a quiet, polite cry. It was the raw, guttural sobbing of someone watching a life slip away. She pressed her hands frantically against the gaping, terrifying wound near his collarbone. She did not care about the blood soaking her hands or ruining her clothes. She pressed down with all her strength, trying desperately to stem the torrential, pulsing flow of crimson. "Hold on, Caleb." she begged, her voice cracking, tears streaming down her face and mixing with the blood on her hands. Please, just hold on. Do not close your eyes. Caleb wanted to comfort her. He wanted to tell her it was okay. But he had absolutely no strength left. He turned his focus entirely back to Elias. The shooter had taken a single hesitant step forward. The loud crunch of his heavy boot, stepping on broken glass, echoed down the long corridor. Elias racked the bolt of the rifle again. The sharp mechanical click sounded like a death sentence in the enclosed space. Caleb knew he had to do something. He could not fight Elias physically. He could not run. All he had left was his voice. He forced himself to take a shallow, agonizing breath. It felt like inhaling broken glass. Elias, Caleb choked out. The name was barely a whisper. It was a weak, wet sound, drowned out by the blaring sirens of the code-red alarm. But in the strange, terrifying acoustics of the hallway, Elias heard it. Elias stopped dead in his tracks. He lowered the barrel of the rifle just a fraction of an inch. He looked at Caleb confused. Elias knew Caleb, but only as a background character. They had sat near each other under the cold metal bleachers during a massive rainstorm last year. Elias had been crying silently over a destroyed art project, completely broken by the bullies. Caleb had been hiding from the bitter cold, pretending not to notice. They were both ghosts haunting the exact same school, but entirely invisible to everyone else. "Please, Caleb," whispered, blood bubbling at the corner of his pale lips. "Look at me." Elias stared. He saw the sheer, undeniable devastation he had just caused. He saw the life draining out of a boy who was just as broken and just as forgotten as he was. "You do not want this." Caleb gasped, his grip on Maya's jacket, tightening with a final desperate surge of strength. "I know they hurt you. I know they hurt Tommy." But she did not. Maya did not do it. The words hit Elias harder than a physical blow. The mention of his brother's name pierced straight through the heavy psychotic fog in his mind. The dark metallic rage that had carried him into the school suddenly shattered into a million useless pieces. Elias looked down at his own hands. He looked at the heavy black rifle. He looked at the massive pool of Caleb's blood painting the pristine floor tiles a horrifying, vibrant red. The pure, unadulterated sacrifice in Caleb's eyes was a mirror. It reflected back the absolute monster Elias was about to become. Elias was trying to punish the untouchables, but instead he had just murdered the most vulnerable, invisible boy in Pine Ridge. Suddenly, the wail of police sirens breached the heavy brick walls of the high school. It was a rising, terrifying crescendo of approaching authority. The local police, the state troopers, and the emergency medical teams were arriving. The reality of the situation crashed down on Elias with crushing, undeniable force. Elias slowly lowered the weapon completely. His hands were shaking violently. He took a staggering, unsteady step backward. He opened his hands, letting the heavy rifle drop to the floor. It hit the linoleum with a hollow, useless clatter. Without saying a single word, Elias turned around. He ran toward the cafeteria, where a tactical police unit would apprehend him 3 minutes later, sitting quietly at an empty lunch table, sobbing with his head buried in his hands. In the C wing, the silence returned, but it was no longer a boring, heavy silence. It was the terrifying, suffocating silence of the aftermath. Maya scrambled out from under Caleb's heavier weight. She pulled his head gently into her lap. Her hands pressed desperately, frantically against the gaping, bloody wound on his chest. "Hold on, Caleb, just hold on," she sobbed, rocking him slightly back and forth. "They are coming. The police are coming." Caleb looked up at her. His vision was swimming heavily. The flashing strobe lights above them looked like brilliant, fading halos. He felt cold. It was a familiar cold, much deeper and more permanent than the freezing nights inside his rusted Chevy Nova. "Did he get you, Caleb?" whispered, his pale eyelids fluttering violently. "No," Maya cried, pressing her bloody hands harder against his chest, trying to stop the inevitable. "No, you saved me. You stupid, brave idiot. You saved me." Caleb managed a faint, bloody smile. The corners of his lips turned up ever so slightly. "Good," he murmured, his voice fading into the darkness. "You have people waiting for you." His eyes slowly rolled back. The heavy, crushing weight of survival finally lifted from his shoulders, and the invisible ghost of Pine Ridge High School faded quietly into the dark. The aftermath of the Pine Ridge High School shooting was a chaotic, terrifying blur. It was a massive collision of flashing red and blue lights, screaming sirens, and the frantic, heavy shouts of tactical police units. Heavily armed officers breached the front glass doors, their heavy boots pounding against the polished linoleum. They swept through the dark hallways, clearing barricaded classrooms and shouting loud, aggressive commands to secure the building. Paramedics followed closely behind the police shield wall. They burst through the heavy magnetic fire doors of the C-Wing, pushing a heavy metal trauma gurney. Their boots slipped noticeably on the blood-slicked floor. The sheer amount of blood covering the white tiles was staggering. It looked like a brutal, devastating battlefield, not a quiet high school hallway. They found Maya Rossi sitting on the cold floor. She was completely covered in dark red blood. Her hands were pressed desperately with all her body weight against the chest of a boy who looked entirely too fragile and too thin to have ever survived a high-velocity rifle round. Caleb Vance was completely unresponsive. His eyes were closed, his head tilted unnaturally back against Maya's legs. His skin had turned a translucent, terrifying shade of gray. His lips were a pale, sickly blue. The paramedics moved with brutal, practiced efficiency. They shoved Maya gently but firmly aside. "We need space," the lead paramedic shouted, dropping his heavy medical jump bag onto the floor beside Caleb. He immediately began packing the massive, catastrophic exit wound near Caleb's collarbone with heavy, chemically treated hemostatic gauze. Another paramedic quickly pulled out a needle, trying desperately to find a viable vein in Caleb's arm. But the boy's veins had completely collapsed from the massive, rapid blood loss, combined with the severe chronic dehydration of his homeless diet. "I cannot get a line." The second paramedic yelled, his gloved hand slipping on Caleb's blood. "He is completely drained. He has absolutely no blood pressure. Start an intraosseous IV right into his shin bone," the lead medic commanded, his voice tight with panic. He strapped a heavy plastic oxygen mask over Caleb's pale, motionless face. "We are losing him right now. The subclavian artery is definitely nicked. He has a massive tension pneumothorax. Let us move, move, move." They hoisted Caleb's limp, broken body onto the gurney. The heavy metal wheels rattled loudly, echoing off the lockers as they rushed him down the long corridor toward the exit. Maya stumbled blindly behind them. Her vintage flannel shirt, her jeans, and her favorite denim jacket were soaked completely through with Caleb's blood. It was warm, it was sticky, and it smelled heavily of iron and copper. A local police officer stepped directly in front of her, holding up his hands. He tried to stop her, trying to guide her toward the secure triage tent, set up for uninjured students in the gymnasium. "Miss, you need to come with me," the officer said gently, reaching for her shaking arm. "You are in deep shock. We need to get you checked out." Maya fought him off like a wild, cornered animal. She aggressively pushed his hands away, her dark eyes completely locked on the trauma gurney, disappearing out the double glass doors into the freezing winter air. "Do not touch me," she screamed, her voice cracking with raw, unfiltered panic. "He saved my life. I am not leaving him here." She shoved past the officer, running out into the snow, and forced her way into the back of a following police cruiser, demanding to be taken to the emergency room. 20 miles away on the dark, heavily forested outskirts of Pine Ridge sat the Iron Hounds Motorcycle Club compound. It was a massive fortified property surrounded by tall steel fences and heavy security cameras. Inside the main garage, the air was thick with the harsh smell of motor oil, stale tobacco, and cold beer. The heavy black rotary phone on the garage wall began to ring. It was a loud, obnoxious, blaring sound that cut sharply through the noise of classic rock music and the loud revving of motorcycle engines. Bear Carmichael, the club's massive sergeant-at-arms, walked slowly over to the wall. He picked up the heavy plastic receiver. He was a giant man, covered in faded complex ink, with a thick graying beard. He listened to the frantic voice on the other end of the line for exactly 10 seconds. He did not say a single word. He just listened, closely. Then he slammed the receiver down onto the metal hook. He hit it so hard the thick plastic actually cracked down the middle. Bear turned around. He walked slowly into the center of the main garage. Big Vic Rossi, the fearsome president of the Iron Hounds, was bent over the open engine block of a custom chopper. His massive calloused hands were covered in black grease. Vic Bear said. His voice had dropped a full octave. It carried a dark, grim, terrible weight that made the other 6 bikers in the room stop dead in their tracks. The classic rock music suddenly felt entirely too loud. Big Vic stood up slowly. He wiped his dirty hands on a heavy red shop towel. He looked directly at his oldest friend. There was a shooting at the high school. Bear set his eyes locked firmly on his president. It is bad, Vic. Maya was right in the middle of it. Big Vic dropped his heavy steel wrench. The tool hit the concrete floor with a loud, sharp crack. It echoed through the massive garage like a gunshot. He did not ask any questions. He did not blink. He did not waste a single second breathing. The protective, terrifying, unstoppable rage of a father instantly consumed him. Within 60 seconds, the massive garage doors flew open. The deafening, earth-shaking roar of a dozen heavy V-twin engines tore through the quiet Oregon forest. The bikers rode out in a tight, aggressive, perfectly synchronized formation. Big Vic was at the very front, riding his massive black cruiser. His face was a terrifying mask of absolute unyielding fury. They tore down the winding, icy mountain roads, pushing their heavy motorcycles to the absolute limit. They did not stop for red lights. They did not slow down for stop signs. The local Pine Ridge police cruisers, recognizing the dark, thundering formation of the Iron Hounds, tearing toward the city, quickly pulled over to the snowy shoulder. The cops knew much better than to stand between Big Vic Rossi and his daughter. It was a total suicide mission to try and slow them down today. When Big Vic and his crew finally arrived at Pine Ridge General Hospital, the emergency room lobby was an absolute madhouse. It was packed shoulder to shoulder with sobbing parents, frantic local news crews carrying bright cameras, and dozens of heavily armed state police officers trying to maintain order. Big Vic walked straight through the automatic sliding doors. The sheer, terrifying physical presence of the man parted the crowded room like Moses at the Red Sea. He stood 6 feet and 5 inches tall. His heavy leather cut proudly displayed the notorious Iron Hounds patch. Bear and 4 other fully patched members flanked him closely, their hands resting ominously on their heavy leather belts. "Where is my daughter?" Big Vic demanded to a terrified triage nurse standing safely behind the front desk. His voice was a low, rumbling growl that physically vibrated in the chests of everyone standing nearby. Before the pale, shaking nurse could stammer out a reply, a small, completely blood-soaked figure launched herself from a cheap plastic waiting room chair. Maya collided with her father. She buried her face directly into his heavy leather vest. Big Vic's massive arms instantly enveloped her. His large, rough hands checked her back, her arms and her shoulders frantically feeling for bullet holes or broken bones. "I am okay. Dad, I am okay," she sobbed, clutching his leather vest like a lifeline in a storm. "But he is dying, Dad. He is dying, and it is entirely my fault." Big Vic pulled back slightly. His dark, intense eyes scanned the thick, wet, terrifying amount of blood covering his daughter's clothes. This was not just a little scratch. This was the catastrophic, messy bleeding of a mortal wound. "Whose blood is this?" Maya Big Vic asked, his voice deathly quiet, providing a stark, scary contrast to his massive size. "Who did this? His name is Caleb," choked out her entire body, trembling violently under the heavy weight of shock. "He pushed me down. He jumped right in front of the gun. Dad, the shooter, was aiming directly at me. Caleb took the bullet. He wrapped his body around me to shield me." The fierce, protective, violent rage in Big Vic's eyes suddenly shifted. It morphed into something entirely different. It turned into a profound, unbreakable, ancient sense of debt. In the dark, rough, unforgiving world of the Iron Hounds Motorcycle Club, a life saved is a blood debt. It is a sacred, unbreakable bond that transcends and beyond all other laws of normal society. You do not ignore a man who bleeds for your family. "Where is this boy?" Big Vic asked, looking up at the closed surgical doors. "Surgery," Maya whispered, wiping her face, smearing more blood across her pale cheek. "They said his heart completely stopped in the ambulance." Big Vic nodded slowly. He looked back at Bear and gave a sharp, subtle nod of his heavy head. The Iron Hounds moved perfectly as one unit. They walked over to the intensive care waiting area, and they effectively took it over. Nobody asked them to leave. The heavily armed police officers in the lobby kept a very respectful, wide distance. Big Vic sat down on a small plastic chair. He pulled Maya close to his side, wrapping his massive arm tightly around her shoulders. He sat entirely still, his dark eyes staring a literal hole through the swinging double doors of the surgical ward. He was ready to wait all night. He was ready to fight death himself if it came walking through those doors. The agonizing hours that followed felt like a heavy, suffocating eternity. The clock on the white hospital wall ticked with a loud, mocking rhythm. Every single minute that passed felt like a physical weight pressing down on the waiting room. The Iron Hounds had effectively taken over the entire east wing of the intensive care unit. They did not shout. They did not cause trouble. And they did not pace. They simply existed, a massive, silent wall of leather and muscle, standing guard over a boy they had never even met. Maya refused to leave her father's side. She refused the nurses who offered her clean clothes, and she violently refused to wash the drying, dark red blood from her hands. It was Caleb's blood. To wash it away felt like an absolute, unforgivable betrayal. She sat perfectly still, staring blankly at the swinging double doors of the surgical ward, quietly begging whatever higher power existed to let the invisible boy live. At exactly 4 p.m, the heavy metallic doors finally pushed open. A trauma surgeon stepped out into the waiting area. He wore pale green surgical scrubs, completely covered in dark, terrifying stains. He pulled his mask down below his chin, revealing a face that looked entirely drained of all energy. He let out a long, heavy sigh, looking around the room, clearly confused by the intimidating, heavily armed biker presence in the cardiology wing, family of Caleb Vance. The surgeon asked, his tired voice echoing slightly in the quiet hallway. Big Vic stood up immediately. The heavy leather of his boots creaked loudly in the sterile, quiet room. He walked right up to the exhausted doctor, using his massive height to command the space. "Right here," Big Vic said, his deep voice leaving absolutely no room for argument. The surgeon swallowed hard. He looked at the terrifying death head patch on Vic's leather cut, then back up to his intense, dark eyes. The doctor wisely decided not to question the unusual family dynamic. He survived the surgery. The doctor said, his voice trembling just a fraction. It was incredibly close. The bullet shattered his left clavicle into dozens of pieces, missed his heart by less than an inch, and completely tore through his upper lung. He is currently on a ventilator to help him breathe, but his vitals are slowly stabilizing. Maya let out a sharp, gasping sob. Her entire body slumped forward, the sheer, crushing relief washing over her like a tidal wave. Bear Carmichael let out a long, heavy breath, placing his massive hand gently on Maya's shoulder. However, the surgeon continued his tone, shifting into something much darker and much more serious. There is a massive, highly concerning complication. What kind of complication? Bear growled softly from behind Big Vic. It is not just the gunshot wound, the doctor sighed, rubbing his forehead wearily. When we ran his initial blood work and examined his body during the operation, we found a terrifying truth. This boy is suffering from severe, prolonged malnutrition. He is literally starving to death. He has early-stage scurvy, severe vitamin deficiencies, and cracked ribs that are at least a month old. He also has serious frostbite damage on his toes. The words hung in the air, cold, heavy, and absolutely devastating. We contacted the local school district and the state child services office. The surgeon added quietly. They informed us that Caleb has no living parents. He is officially listed as a ward of the state. He ran away from the system months ago. The police found his belongings an hour ago. He has been living inside a broken, unheated car behind the old lumber mill. Maya gasped loudly, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. The horrifying pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicked together in her mind. The pale skin, the faded flannel shirt in the freezing winter, the desperate hollow look in his eyes when he dropped his papers. The boy who had thrown his fragile, starving body in front of an assault rifle. The boy who had spilled his own blood to save her was slowly freezing to death in the shadows of her own town because he has no health insurance, no legal guardian, and requires incredibly expensive, specialized reconstructive surgeries to ever use his left arm again. The state has intervened, the surgeon explained carefully. The county administration is ordering him transferred to the underfunded state facility downtown as soon as he is medically stabilized tonight. We simply do not have the legal authorization or the financial backing to keep him in our intensive care unit. Big Vic's jaw tightened. The thick veins in his neck visibly bulged against his faded tattoos. A boy who had given absolutely everything to save an Iron Hound was about to be tossed back into a broken, uncaring system just to be forgotten all over again. The twist in Caleb's fate did not come from a medical miracle. It came from the brutal, unyielding loyalty of the outlaw motorcycle code. Before the surgeon could say another word, a sharply dressed man walked down the hallway. It was Dr. Alden Sterling, the chief hospital administrator. He held a thick plastic clipboard, his face a perfect mask of cold, bureaucratic indifference. He was followed closely by a nervous state social worker. Dr. Sterling stopped in front of the intensive care unit entrance, but he found his path completely blocked. Standing shoulder to shoulder, forming an impenetrable human wall, were 4 massive members of the Iron Hounds, their arms heavily crossed over their chests. "Gentlemen, you need to step aside immediately." "Doctor," Sterling said, tapping his pen against his clipboard, completely unaware of the extreme danger he was inviting. "We are legally transferring the Vance boy to the County General Hospital. He is a ward of the state, and this is a premium private medical facility. He does not have the financial coverage to occupy this bed." Big Vic Rossi slowly stepped around the surgeon. He walked right up to the administrator, looking down at the smaller man, with eyes that had seen decades of brutal street warfare. "The boy stays right here," Big Vic stated. Simply his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "Mr. Rossi, I understand your daughter was involved in the tragedy today," Dr. Sterling said, adjusting his expensive glasses, trying desperately not to show his growing intimidation. "But you have absolutely no legal standing here. The reconstructive surgeries he desperately needs will cost upwards of $200,000. The state will absolutely not pay our private rates. He must be moved tonight. It is a liability issue." Big Vic did not argue the law. He did not raise his voice, and he did not make a dramatic threat. He simply reached into the deep inside pocket of his heavy leather jacket. He pulled out a thick, tightly wrapped, vacuum-sealed brick of $100 bills. He slammed the heavy brick of cash directly onto the nearby nurse's station counter. The heavy, solid thud made the hospital administrator physically jump backward. "That is $50,000 in unmarked cash." "As a down payment," Big Vic growled, stepping so incredibly close to Sterling that the administrator could smell the harsh blend of motor oil and stale smoke. "You will put him in your absolute best VIP recovery suite," Vic commanded. "You will hire the best reconstructive surgeon in the entire state of Oregon. If that boy wakes up and his pillow is too flat or his room is too cold, I will hold you personally and physically responsible." Dr. Sterling looked at the massive pile of cash, his eyes wide with shock. "You want to talk to me about legal standing?" Vic continued, leaning down to speak directly into the administrator's ear. "My club's corporate lawyers are filing emergency foster care paperwork with a state judge right now. He is no longer a ward of the state. He is under the absolute protection of the Iron Hounds Motorcycle Club. Do we have a crystal clear understanding, Doctor?" Dr. Sterling looked at the cash again, then looked up at the terrifying, unmoving wall of giant men backing Vic up. He swallowed dryly, his bureaucratic confidence completely shattered. "I will inform the surgical team to prep the private suite immediately." Sterling stammered, backing away slowly. Big Vic turned his back on the administrator, entirely dismissing him. He walked over to Maya, wrapping his heavy arms around his crying daughter once again. The invisible boy was finally safe. 3 days later, Caleb finally opened his eyes. The room was aggressively bright, filled with a warm, artificial light that immediately made him squint. For a terrifying, disorienting second, his mind flashed backward. He expected to see the frosted, taped windows of the 1989 Chevy Nova. He braced his frail body for the biting, unforgiving cold. He waited for the gnawing, painful twist of severe hunger in his stomach. But the cold never came. Instead, he felt the soft, incredibly warm weight of a heavy, heated blanket draped perfectly over his legs. The pain in his left shoulder was a dull, heavy constant, throbbing heavily, muted by the steady drip of strong, intravenous narcotics. He tried to move his arm to sit up, but a heavy brace held his shoulder completely immobile. The sudden slight movement triggered a sharp spike on the heart monitor beside his bed. The rapid beeping broke the quiet silence of the room. "Take it easy, kid," a deep, rumbling voice commanded softly. "Do not try to move just yet." Caleb slowly turned his head to the right. Sitting in a massive leather armchair beside his bed, looking entirely out of place in a sterile hospital room, was Big Vic Rossi. Beside him, holding Caleb's right hand tightly, was Maya. She looked incredibly exhausted with dark circles under her eyes, but a radiant, tearful smile broke across her face the absolute second she saw him look at her. "Maya," Caleb croaked. His throat felt like dry sandpaper. His voice was weak, barely a scratchy whisper. "Are you okay?" he asked, his brow furrowing with sudden worry. "Did he hurt you?" "I am perfectly fine, Caleb." Maya whispered, her voice thick with emotion, tears quickly spilling over her dark eyelashes. "Because of you. You saved my life. I am entirely unharmed." Caleb relaxed slightly, sinking his heavy head back into the soft, thick pillows. He looked around the massive, luxurious private recovery suite. He saw the expensive equipment, the large television, and the large floral arrangements. Panic, cold and familiar, instantly seized his chest. His breathing grew rapid and shallow. "Where am I?" Caleb asked, his voice rising in terror. "I cannot afford this place. I need to leave right now. If the state social workers find out I am here, they will send me back to the juvenile group home. I cannot go back there. I have to get to my car. I have to move it before they tow it." Big Vic leaned forward, resting his massive tattooed forearms heavily on his knees. The heavy leather of his jacket creaked loudly. "Nobody is sending you anywhere, son," Big Vic said. His gruff, intimidating voice was surprisingly gentle, carrying a heavy, comforting warmth. "My name is Vic," he continued, looking directly into Caleb's panicked eyes. "I am Maya's father." Caleb's eyes widened in absolute terror. He knew exactly who Big Vic Rossi was. Everyone in Pine Ridge knew. The invisible boy had accidentally crossed paths with the most dangerous family in the county. "Sir, I am so sorry," Caleb stammered frantically, trying to push himself up with his one good arm. "I did not mean to cause trouble. I will disappear. You will never see me again." "Stop talking and listen to me," Big Vic commanded, his tone firm, but deeply kind. Vic reached out. His massive, calloused, grease-stained hand gently rested on Caleb's uninjured right shoulder. "You had absolutely nothing in this world," Caleb Vic said slowly, making sure every single word landed. "You were living in a freezing, broken car. You were starving to death entirely alone, with absolutely nobody looking out for you. The world turned its back on you. But when that kid walked down that hallway with a rifle, you did not run away. You did not hide in the shadows. You threw away your own life to protect my little girl. You took a bullet to give her the breath in her lungs." Vic paused, taking a deep, heavy breath, his dark eyes shining with unshed, powerful emotion. "In my world, blood pays for blood," Vic continued softly. "It is the absolute, unbreakable rule we live by. But you gave your blood to save it. So the heavy debt is entirely mine, and it belongs to my club. You do not ever have to worry about a medical bill. You do not have to worry about a freezing car. And you sure as hell do not have to worry about the state putting you in a broken home." Caleb stared at the giant man, completely overwhelmed. The reality of the words slowly sank into his exhausted, healing mind. For the very first time since his father died, the crushing, suffocating weight of mere survival began to lift entirely from his shattered chest. He was no longer invisible. 2 weeks later, the crisp, cold day of Caleb's hospital discharge finally arrived. The winter air in Pine Ridge was biting and sharp, but the sky had finally cleared, revealing a brilliant, bright blue canvas. Caleb was sitting in a heavy hospital wheelchair. His left arm was heavily immobilized in a complex metal brace, bolted safely to his shoulder. His face still held a pale tint, but his hollow cheeks had filled out slightly. He was wearing a brand new, incredibly warm, heavy leather jacket that Maya had bought specifically for him. A smiling nurse wheeled him slowly toward the automatic sliding glass doors of the main hospital entrance. Big Vic and Maya walked closely beside him, a united front. "I still do not fully understand how you got the state judge to agree to the permanent foster placement," Caleb said, looking up at the giant man walking next to him. "State judges really like to be re-elected." Big Vic smirked, a dark, knowing glint in his eye. "And they really do not like it when a highly motivated, heavily funded motorcycle club hires the most vicious, expensive corporate lawyers in the state to argue fiercely on behalf of a local recognized hero. "You are coming home to the compound with us, kid. You are family now." As the automatic glass doors parted, a massive, incredible sound hit Caleb like a physical shockwave. It was a low, guttural, earth-shaking rumble. It violently vibrated through the solid concrete floor and rattled the heavy glass windows of the hospital lobby. Caleb looked out into the massive parking lot, and his breath caught painfully in his throat. The entire circular hospital driveway, stretching all the way down the long block and spilling entirely out onto the main street, was filled with heavy motorcycles. There were not just a few riders. There were 300 Iron Hounds. Chapters from across the entire state of Oregon, and even members from neighboring Washington, had ridden through the freezing, bitter winter wind just for this specific moment. They sat proudly on their massive custom choppers, heavy baggers, and sleek cruisers. They all wore their dark leather cuts, proudly their patches fully displayed. As Caleb's wheelchair officially emerged into the bright winter sunlight, 300 hardened bikers began to simultaneously aggressively rev their massive engines. The deafening unified roar was a symphony of raw, unfiltered, absolute respect. It was a terrifying, beautiful, overwhelmingly powerful sound that completely drowned out the dark, lingering memories of screaming sirens, the absolute fear of the hallway, and the lonely ghosts of Caleb's freezing past. In the exact centers of the massive formation, Bear Carmichael sat on a huge, custom-built, three-wheeled trike. The back featured a large, thickly padded passenger seat. Bear patted the empty leather seat with his heavy hand, looking right at the stunned boy in the wheelchair. The state social worker, standing nervously near the entrance doors with her useless clipboard, watched in absolute stunned silence. She watched as the homeless, forgotten boy she had nearly thrown into a neglected, broken system was carefully, gently lifted from his hospital wheelchair by the terrifying president of the Iron Hounds. Big Vic placed Caleb securely onto the back of Bear's massive trike, making sure his injured arm was perfectly safe. Maya climbed gracefully onto the back of her father's heavy street glide cruiser, wrapping her arms tightly around his waist. Big Vic kicked his heavy bike into gear. The engine roared to life. He looked directly over his shoulder, his eyes locking onto the young boy who had saved his entire world. "Are you ready to go home, Caleb?" Vic yelled over the massive noise of the idling engines. Caleb looked around at the 300 rough-scarred, loyal outlaws who had gathered in the freezing cold just to escort a forgotten, invisible street kid safely into his brand-new life. He felt the heavy, comforting leather of his new jacket. He felt the bright warmth of the winter sun on his face. And most importantly, he felt the undeniable permanent presence of a real family. "Yeah." Caleb smiled widely, hot tears of absolute joy finally falling freely down his healing cheeks. "I am completely ready." With a final unified, earth-shattering thunderclap of heavy exhaust pipes, the massive column of 300 Iron Hounds slowly pulled out of the hospital lot. They rode in a tight, heavily protective formation, surrounding the boy who was entirely no longer a ghost. The terrifying echo of the gunshot in the high school hallway was forever replaced by the beautiful, powerful thunder of 300 heavy engines. Caleb Vance, the invisible ghost of Pine Ridge, had stepped bravely in front of a deadly bullet, and he had found a permanent family forged deeply in blood, heavy leather, and gasoline. True heroism never asks for permission, and real brotherhood never ever checks a bank account. Sometimes the strongest, most protective angels walking on this earth are the ones riding straight out of the dark shadows just to bring you safely home into the light. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this journey touched your heart, please leave a comment down below telling me what beautiful city you are currently living in. Do not forget to hit that like button, and please subscribe to the channel for for more deeply emotional, powerful stories, just like this one.